use a French word. And oftentimes the French words are the ones that you use in an elevated register, right? It's like the choice between saying commence or begin, right? Commence is French, begin is Germanic, okay? So there's a greater prestige influence from French in Middle High German than Latin in Old High German. So we find a lot more influence on the text. A relatively large corpus, millions of lines and thousands of texts in all possible medieval genres, unlike Old High German, where we're dealing with the relatively small ones. There is also contact with Slavic and Baltic languages as the German peoples, or German-speaking peoples, expand to the east. So quite a different situation from the Old High German period. Okay. And there's also the earliest development of the Hanseatic League, so in the Baltic so this is a dialect map of modern German dialects, but it also applies to the Middle High German period, because by that point, largely the lines that we have today were already set. Okay. So once again, where is the High German area? South, right? So this is Austria, this is Switzerland, this is Bavaria, that's Swabia. That's the really High German area, right? Which turns into, you see this dotted line? Between that dotted line and the solid line above, it's called Mitteldeutsch, which should be clear. And then you have Low German, or Niederdeutsch, to the north. And as I said, all of these dialects are the ones that existed in the Middle High German period, too. So we have still Swanger, okay, like we had in Old High German, Schwanger. We also have Swanger werden, but we also have the addition in the Middle High German period of eines Kindes, to be pregnant of a child, we'd say with a child, but of a child. Okay. And also the literary circumlocution lieb bodies that stands in for person. So, von sina mine wirst du Kindes schwanger, and love here, I'm also kind of using a euphemism. One doesn't become pregnant by love alone, so I think you know what they're saying. Den Lieb soll werden schwanger. You shall become pregnant. But we also have other expansions, not just eines Kindes schwanger, but also mit Kinder befangen ziehen, eines Kindes nothaft werden, eines Kindes schwer werden, eines Kindes haft werden. I left out a word there. For haft werden should be something like caught or almost in a sense trapped with child. Okay? So not necessarily what we think of as a positive image, but same thing with mit Kinder befangen ziehen, to be seized or caught with a child. Right? And mit Kinder verladen ziehen, to be loaded with a child. Okay, right? So you see, it's the same types of images that we get when we have modern English terms like a bun in the oven, right? Here's some examples. Mit Kinder bin ich nun befangen, eines Kindes ward sie nothaft. Yeah, to be distressed with a child, or in distress with a child also, it doesn't sound very positive. Sie wär eines Kindes schwere. Was auch sie wurden kindeshaft, wann sie mit Kinder was verladen, etc. Right? So to these we can add simple collocations, that is like verbs plus nouns. As I mentioned earlier, things like to take a shower, right? A verb that has to go with a noun that doesn't necessarily have a lot of meaning. So, and kindtragen, to carry a child, to bear a child, and other groups in the same semantic field. We can also look at terms to make someone pregnant, jemanden schwanger machen, and von Worte schwanger werden, which means to become pregnant through words. Sounds like a very specific and sort of strange thing, but if you think about medieval literature and just how often people are talking about Mary and the birth of Jesus, this is something that comes up quite often. So the question remains, are these examples of poetic formulae only? Because if we're dealing with poetic texts, and most of these come from poetry, not prose, we have to think about rhyme and meter and all of the other things I mentioned earlier. So are these real phrases that people are possibly, and we can't prove this because we can't talk to them and ask, But are these phrases that people are actually using, or are they inventions of poets? Right? So some criteria we can look at. One is that rhyme is not restrictive in the way that oftentimes people think it is. In other words, syntax can change to fulfill stereotypical rhymes in the same lexemes of words, single words, may rhyme in non-phraseological configurations. In other words, we can see in the poetry that sometimes if one wants to use a phrase, you just switch it around, right? German syntax is a little more fluid than modern English syntax, and you know that from your classes, right? If you want to put the subject first, that's fine, but you can also put, say, an object first in a German sentence, right? And then what comes next? Verb, good. So we can change the syntax, and if we can change the syntax like that, we can fit more phrases in, more words that we want to use to get a rhyme at the end that we need to rhyme with something else. We also have occurrence of the same phrase across text types and genres, which supports inclusion within the general lexis of Middle High German. Lexis is a fancy linguistic term for vocabulary. We also have fixity, and we'll say relative fixity, because in the medieval period, people weren't so picky about writing things down the exact same way all the same time like we do now. But relative fixity, in combination with repetition, also points towards real phrases that exist in the language and not just a poetic creative expression. So here we see a long list of other ways of describing Bibelbreit. Some of them phraseological, some of them single words. We've got adjectives, nouns.
Schlafen.
Yeah. So it's impossible to determine whether all of the words that are new here and are not on that Old High German list are developments or continuations, because all we have is what we have. We deal with the texts we have and make assumptions, right? So that's hard to say. But there is a far greater number of forms and examples, and we don't have this. The asterisk means this form doesn't exist. But if Middle High German had the same phrase as Old High German, that's what it would look like. Either of those verb forms. So no other lexemes in this group appear to have been lost from changing from Old High German to Middle High German. So what does this tell us, if anything? Right? The concepts that lie behind the phrases, the imagery, right? Heaviness, fullness, children, also things like being caught or trapped or in distress, which is something that we don't have in English for pregnancy words, are maintained while the complexity and number of phrases increases. And we often move from collocations, that is just simple verb-noun phrases, to larger, more complicated types of phrases. In a related issue is that the etymological background for the semantic field is Germanic. As I mentioned, Middle High German has a strong influence from French, but we don't see it in this semantic field. French terms are not used to describe pregnancy. There are also different contextual usage across text, which reveals possible registers of colloquial and formal language. Some combinations could be something of the equivalent of Mary had a bun in the oven, right? Which you wouldn't say if you were a monk writing a religious text. In other words, we have all of those phrases, some of which are, even though we can't necessarily tell which ones in all cases, but some of these phrases would be inappropriate in some uses than others, right? So you can begin to compile registers of what type of language is colloquial, what type of language is formal, what's applicable in a religious context, and what is not. This also reveals a level of discomfort, right? The more ways we have of talking about something without just saying it shows that there's some discomfort. But there's a greater narrative need in Middle High German to talk about pregnancy than in Old High German because of the types of texts, right? What kind of texts did I say exist in Old High German? Does anyone remember? Right, a lot of religious texts, right? And there are people who get pregnant in religious texts, but there's one really important one, and we've already been discussing that, right? Not a lot of secular narratives, right? Like romances and epic poetry and things like that. But we get more of that in Middle High German, which is why we have a greater profusion of these words. It's not that they necessarily didn't exist in Old High German, it's just that we don't have them because we don't have the types of text. And as the secular euphemisms increase in Middle High German, we lose the one possibly religious euphemism from Old High German. And why do you think that saying, using the verb created or formed might be possibly religious? Or have a religious connotation? Yes?
Isn't that how we see it in Genesis?
Right, the word creation, right? So, schaffen, right? God created the world. That's the same verb for create that is used in biblical language in German, right? So, it's possible. It's hard to tell. But the text that we find that phrase in is a gospel one, right? So it's very possible. And to give you an idea of some of the other things that you can do with this type of analysis, I'll just share some results from some other studies that I've done. We've got some quotations here because Switzerland was not a country, Germany was not a country, there were no nation states in this period. But we can say the people who spoke Swiss dialects, the people who spoke German dialects. We find differences even in like verbs. So in collocations, it's the difference between if I said, I'll take a nap, and you say that you'll make a nap, right? We find all sorts of differences between dialect areas. A frequent like verb in standard literary Middle High German is stan, which is stehen, to stand, in modern German. But in the Swiss dialects, they use liegen, which means to lie, right? Not the same thing at all, but because they're like verbs, it's not really important what the verb means so much as you use the same one all the time. We also can do things with stylistics and idiolects, like I mentioned earlier. So we find that Konrad von Würzburg uses 14 out of 15 of the extant uses of the phrase der Rede Antwort geben, literally to give an answer to someone's speech. It's a way of saying he answered someone, they answered her, right? But all of those units together in that configuration is something that only this guy uses, with one exception. Okay? So when you compile more data about that for an individual author, you can come up with what their phraseological inventory is and how they modify standard phrases. Another example is that there are two meanings of the phrase jemandem wohl sprechen or jemandem wohl reden, which means literally to speak well to someone. Okay. But in Middle High German, it's used as a pragmatic phrasing, which means, in this case, a greeting, right? You can say, du sollst mir wohl sprechen. Right? You should greet me. Okay? You should say hello. Right? The other way is a literal use. You should speak well of someone. You should say nice things to someone. And there are some ways to distinguish these uses, but not always, which is interesting because this doesn't always happen. So collecting uses of this type can allow us to figure out, for example, what phrases have a literal use and a metaphorical use. This scary word, what does Wahrheit mean? Truth, right? What does this chunk of the word mean? Teuer. Right. Or dear. Okay? So a Wahrheitsbeteuerung is something, a word, a phrase, it's almost always a phrase, that increases the truth value of a statement. Okay? In practical terms, to give an example, in English, you could say, believe me, right? Or, you know, something like that, right? I'm telling the truth here, right? It's a way of saying that. And in Middle High German, it's things like das ist wahr, that is true. They're little units that are stuck onto all sorts of other linguistic units, like sentences, tacked on the end of a line in poetry. It just says, You know, really, this is true, right? But these are actually the most fertile area for expansion. Like where Konrad von Würzburg adds things to a standard phrase, like Antwortgeben to give an answer. The Das ist wahr type is actually the most frequently changed. So it's an area where poets are free to create unique expressions more than other types of phrases. Kinograms, which is just a term that means a verbal expression of nonverbal communication. Okay? So if you say that someone shook their head, right, or you say that someone furrowed their brow, right, both of those actions carry a lot of meaning, right? They're communication, but it's nonverbal communication. And expressing nonverbal communication usually takes the form of a phraseological unit of that type, to shake your head, right, furrow your brow. And these, it turns out, in Middle High German actually play a large role in formalizing the presentation of gender differences in texts. You can explore how these words are used, say, only for women sometimes, certain phrases, or men use a different set than women are given in the way that an author presents a male role and a female role. So there's literary importance to this type of study.